All right, so that was Like a Rolling Stone. Josh, I haven't told you exactly what clip I want from that, but if you want to just play the entire song, I'm totally fine with that. That's probably we're going to get more out of that than we will of any, discourse on this podcast. Because that might be my favorite, Bob. That's the classic Dylan song, and many people, claim that that's his best song of all time.
Is that his most famous song? Probably.
Yeah, it's. Most likely, it was a huge hit, and it's a standard. Even he said at the time, maybe even now, like that's the best song that he had ever written, or one of them anyway. But anyway, so this is number 7 on our list, as John mentioned, Highway 61 Revisited, and it was number 1 in 1965, and number 24 overall of all time. And this is going to be the highest rated Bob Dylan album that we cover in the entire podcast. So the album itself was recorded between June and August of 1965, and it was released on August 30th of 1965. It's Dylan's 6th studio album, and the name of the record came from the highway that is connected from his hometown of Duluth, Minnesota, to various southern cities that were famed for their musical heritage. So cities like St. Louis, Memphis, and New Orleans. And this highway also passed by the birthplace of people like Muddy Waters and Elvis Presley. It's also where Bessie Smith got into a car accident and died from those injuries from the accident on Highway 61, and where they say that Robert Johnson sold his soul to the devil to be able to play the blues. So it's an infamous highway and famous highway, I guess you could say, and that's what Dylan named this album after. The record did sell very well. It peaked at number 3 on the U.S. charts, and it was number 4 on the U.K. charts. I don't have a whole lot of bio on here because we kind of all know that this is right in that this is the first album that really sees Dylan going what people say fully electric, even though it does end with a more of an acoustic song at the end, but it's still technically electric. But this is definitely a more of an electric album than Bringing It All Back Home, which is when he first introduced the electric elements. And in May of 1965, Dylan had returned from touring England, and he was exhausted, of course, and he was starting to get a little dissatisfied with his material. And there was actually, things that I read, which I had never read before, but this week I was reading that there were some reports of him, debating whether he should just give it up and just be done with music and just do something totally different. But he ended up sitting down and writing the accounts vary in length, but it was either between 6 to 20 pages of verse that he just started writing, and what he described as a long piece of vomit. And he ended up reducing this diatribe down to 4 different verses and a chorus, and that song became Like a Rolling Stone. And this is the song that he also said kind of saved him and got him motivated to, restored his enthusiasm for creating music. So this was a personal song for him as well, because it kind of re-energized him after that grueling tour that he was on. So the majority of this album was actually, we have 2 producers here. You've got Tom Wilson, who we've covered many times, but the only song that Tom Wilson produced on this record was Like a Rolling Stone, and that was done in New York in June of 1965. But the rest of the album was recorded later on in that summer, and that was produced by Bob Johnston, who took over, and he was the one that produced the Dylan albums that came out after this, like Blonde on Blonde and John Wesley Harding and Nashville Skyline. So there's, I don't want to go through all the takes, but there's the lyrical content of this album is it's very surreal. It's very literary. There's biblical references, and it's cynical, right? You're not gone to the love songs. Dylan's not really talking about any type of love. It's a lot of this imagery that people have been dissecting and trying to determine the meaning for many, many years. And of course, nobody really knows exactly what it is, because Dylan is always cryptic about the meaning of his lyrics. But that's one of the things that this album is known for, in addition to the electric, kind of blues rock that he's playing, and just the total departure from the protest music that he was doing, the folk music, and but the lyrical content is very different than what he was doing in the past. So I'm going to kind of leave it at that for right now. I mean, that's really what it is. I mean, this was also around the time that he did the famed Newport Folk Festival, in 1965, where he was playing electric songs and got booed off the stage. There was reports that some people were saying, well, he wasn't getting booed because of the music. It was getting booed because the sound equipment wasn't good and it wasn't equipped to handle what he was trying to do, because everybody else is just sitting there like Pete Seeger with a banjo or an acoustic guitar. So there's some discrepancy there, but it's pretty clear that at this time Bob Dylan's folk audience were very much against what he was doing, and they hated him, and they saw this as a betrayal, stabbing in the back, and that type of thing. But Dylan embraced this, and he totally wanted to deviate from his prior self, and so that's what you're getting here. So we'll start with, I don't know, let's go with John. What do you think of Highway 61?
This is a fantastic album. I mean, it starts off with probably the best breakup kiss-off song ever in Like a Rolling Stone. It's just like viscerally, fantastically angry. It's like exactly the song you want to write when you feel like wronged in a relationship. It's really great. And Tombstone Blues that follows it is one of my favorite Dylan songs. It's kind of all of Dylan's best qualities. A chorus that is catchy. His voice doesn't take away from it. The getting back to, and Like a Rolling Stone is like this too. It gets back to a chorus that can be repeated, that is coming, but that's kind of like when Dylan's at his best. Almost none of the songs overstay their welcome because they're all in that 5 to 6 minute range, as opposed to the 8 or 9 minute range when I think Dylan gets in trouble sometimes. I mean, Desolation Row is obviously the exception to that, and it's actually one of my least favorite songs. I know it's a famous song, but it's just too long. I would say this is probably my favorite Dylan album of the 60s that we've covered so far. I think it reins in some of the tendencies that Blonde on Blonde had, that went a little bit too long. There are some songs like Ballad of the Thin Man that can read kind of like as a parody of Dylan at times with some of the lyrics. I can share some lyrics down the road for it that are kind of comical. But then there's songs like Queen Jane Approximately, which I really love at track number 6 of 9. It's a really solid Dylan album. I think it's sort of his peak in the 60s because he's in the electric period, so the musicianship has those great bass lines and the varied nature of the musicianship, but it retains some of the early Dylan folk poet wordsmith before he moves into sort of like the countrified Dylan and starts taking more experimental chances outside of the realm of folk. At this point, he's still doing sort of the same songs as he did when he was making folk rock, just with electric instrumentation behind it. But yeah, really good album. Strong recommend. If you kind of want to know what the hubbub is about Dylan and you haven't figured it out at this point, this would be what I would direct you to in the 60s, because to me this is the perfect balance of early Dylan and later Dylan synthesized, and this is to me him at his peak.
John, have you always felt that way about this album, or do you feel like you liked it more? Okay.
No, the funniest thing about Dylan is the only thing that has surprised me about listening to the Dylan albums is how much I liked his later country stuff. From albums from Freewheelin' Bob Dylan up until Blonde on Blonde, I can't say I changed my mind on what I thought about originally with the Dylan albums. I still think Highway 61 and Blonde on Blonde are by far my two favorite albums there, followed by maybe Blowin' in the Wind. But yeah,
Freewheelin'?
It's funny because I've changed Bring It All Back Home, excuse me.
Okay.
Bring It All Back Home. But I've changed my mind both ways on a lot of different albums we've covered, but Dylan is not someone outside of, Nashville Skyline and John Wesley Harding that I've really changed my mind on.
Right on. All right, Josh.
Yeah, this is probably the essence of Dylan right here on this album. If you wanted to get a snapshot of what he was like when he was electric and what came after, this is probably the best starting point for you if you're new to Dylan. Maybe listen to some of his folk stuff before and then come to this. This is his most reined in or restrained. Like John said, the songs are a bit shorter, which I appreciated, and it seemed like he constructed songs with less verses, as I've harped on a little bit on this one, less on this one than on other albums. But on the other hand, I feel like after listening to all these Bob Dylan albums, many of them they just sound so similar to this. They could probably put other songs from other albums in this, and I wouldn't know exactly what stands out or what's different. Does that make sense? Like, I can't tell. This Bob Dylan isn't marketably different than the album that comes after this or the album that comes after that. And it's all good Dylan, and it's all valuable, and he's got I mean, you know his style at this point, right? After we've listened to 7 albums of him, you know what he's going for. So this isn't revealing anything new, I guess is the point I'm trying to make at this point. It's just like him distilled down to probably the best at what he is doing at this time period.
I would say that I could. Well, I'm sorry. I could probably say that I see what you're saying, but I also can tell some differences. Like, to me, Blonde on Blonde is it's a cleaner album, like in terms of the production. It's a little bit crisper production.
Okay.
And this is a little bit, compared to Bringing It All Back Home, this is Dylan kind of doubling down more on the electric sound, and especially as the overall whole. Even Desolation Road, which is more of that acoustic, it's definitely stands out in terms of that. But when you compare that to the folkier songs like Tambourine Man and Gates of Eden from Bringing It All Back Home, there's a big difference there, I think. So this is him really going all in on the electric part for the most part. So but again, it's one of the but also you're kind of right that these 3 albums are very much like 1A, 1B, 1C of the the Dylan Electric period. So and there's a progression, I think, that's definitely there, but it's not like he's not doing a White Light, White Heat /
right.
Velvet Underground, change here. That's true.
Yeah, I think also kind of the lyrical content is still the same, like poetic, stream of conscious in a way. Like, I mean, like you said about writing a Rolling Stone, I suspect a lot of his lyrics don't mean anything if he's just writing whatever comes to his head and trying to craft it into a song. I think I'd have to really start reading all of the song lyrics to try and parse if there's any sort of meaning or anything. Do you know what I'm saying though?
Good luck, man, because
yeah.
that's a good question, because when you think of this, his lyrics are clearly they're great, whether he's doing like these really important protest songs or he's doing these surreal songs that people are still debating what they're about. But there's no way nobody's ever going to know. And I'm always curious as to, what was going on in his head? What did he really mean when he was writing this? Because in any of his interviews, if you read any of his explanations, it's just like, what are you talking about? They make less sense than the explanation of the lyrics make less sense than the lyrics themselves. So, it's people just leave it up to themselves, and there's all kinds of people guessing on Wikipedia and different articles and books and stuff like that. So,
well, he's one of those artists, at least of what we've heard, that he doesn't really put a lot of personal feelings into his songs or writes about himself, or at least he hides it really well, right? He's just one of those artists that can distance himself, and not every song has to, I'm not saying not every song has to be about you, or that's necessarily the right way to make art, but he's comfortable being an enigma, or at least not bringing a lot of himself into the albums. Yeah. I would say Ballad of a Thin Man is probably one of my favorite Bob Dylan songs. I've always responded to that song and like how it sounds.
Yeah. I probably would say that this is my favorite Dylan album. I know before I was talking about how much I really love Bringing It All Back Home, and it's a real close, for me between these two. And I probably just lean a little bit more here because of Like a Rolling Stone, Ballad of a Thin Man, and Desolation Row in particular. But the other thing that stood out to me in this record too was the piano playing. There's a lot of cool piano parts that are being played here that are out front. They sound like either, like it's like a parlor. I don't know what type of how he's getting that sound or whatever, or what type of piano they're using, but I really think that's got a great sound. And it's like half the songs on this album, it's not just like something like Ballad of a Thin Man, that's almost the primary instrument there, but It Takes a Lot to Laugh, Takes a Train to Cry, it's on there. It's on Queen Jane, it's on like Tom Thumb's Blues. It's just a very great sound, and I picked up on that probably more so this time around than I haven't, or at least than I remember picking up on it in the past. But Like a Rolling Stone is just, there's a reason why people talk about that, right? There, it's just, it is a phenomenal song, and I get just as amped hearing it today as I did, 20 years ago. That song for me it never gets old. I could play it on repeat. I absolutely love that song. Ballad of a Thin Man is just a really cool. I love the way the piano's in that. I love his anger, that he's just screaming. And that's what people say that's about him, kind of reacting to reporters, and the overall, people trying to understand counterculture, type of thing. And, these stiffs and squares that are, writing all these stories. And it's like, you guys don't have no idea what's going on. Something's going on, but you just don't know what it is. So that's what they're kind of saying, what that's about. And Desolation Row. This is I was kind of alluding to this a little bit on when we were covering Blonde on Blonde, but both of these albums end with very long songs. Desolation Row is that a little bit longer? Maybe
it's 11:20.
11:20. I forget exactly what Sad Eyed Lady of the Lowlands is, but I like the melody of this. I like this song much better. There's 10 verses on this song. It's like, it's insane. And actually, if you guys don't want to listen to a whole thing of Dylan doing Desolation Row for over 11 minutes and 10 verses, there's actually a cover version by My Chemical Romance that they used for the Watchmen soundtrack for the movie. Yep. It only comes in at 2:59, and it's only three of the 10 verses. So, and it's punk, and it sounds great. So if you like that at all, you're going to get a little bit more of a modernized sound on that. But
Sad Eyed Lady is 2 seconds shorter than Desolation Row.
Yeah, I've always liked this better. The first time I heard that, Desolation Row, I like the guitar part, like the solo. It's not like a Spanish guitar, but whatever that's the guitar solo is in the background, because it's not just strumming. It's more like it's note picking and stuff like that too. It's kind of it's got a good guitar sound on that as well. But you got some great blues stuff on here. The organ, that's the other thing too. You hear a lot of the organ, and that's one of the funny things. That's one of the most prominent instruments on Like a Rolling Stone, and that's played by Al Cooper, who we talked about, the Blood, Sweat, and Tears guy. But he was a guest in the studio, one of Tom Wilson's guests, and he wanted to play, right? And he's like, "Oh, I'll go play the organ." And Tom Wilson's like, "Man, you're a guitar player. You can't play the keyboard." But he snuck his way onto the floor where they had all the instruments, and he just sat down at an organ. And he's like, "No, man, I got a great part for this." And he's totally making it up. He's just trying to get to play. And so when you listen to him playing on the track, he comes in several parts throughout the song. He comes in like a beat or a half a beat late, and it's because he's trying to make sure that he knows what the chord is before he plays it. So he's listening to the band to hear what they're playing, and then he comes in with the chord. So it gives us this, but it ends up being like a really unique aspect of the song, and it was totally him just like talking his way onto the set, which I thought was an interesting story. But this is classic Dylan, Electric Dylan. I think if you want best of both worlds, that's why I like bringing it all back home, because you're going to get more of the acoustic. It's not really, I wouldn't say it's like in the same vein as the protest songs that he was doing, or the movement songs, although there are similar themes, but you're getting the sound, right? The Dylan sound of those types of songs from like Times Are Changing and Free Will and Bob Dylan. So I really like that album because of that, because I think it's got the best mix of both worlds. But as an overall album, this is more cohesive, and this has, I'd probably say, overall stronger tracks, and it's classic Dylan, and I like this much better than Blonde on Blonde. I still think Blonde on Blonde's a little bit long. It's still very good, but I think this is an edgier. We were talking about edge before. I think overall there's more edge on here. I like the little bit lower fi production style of this, and it's classic. You got to listen to it.
Yep, I agree. Where does Dylan go after this? We've talked about 7 albums, and the last one, or the chronologically, Nashville Skyline is the most recent one that we talked about. Yeah,
that was like 1969.
Blonde on Blonde's after this, and then the 2 country albums, John
right?
Wesley
And then
Harding and Nashville Skyline, right? Yeah. That's where he goes after that, and then he's in the 70s.
And then
so
he goes
does
in.
yeah.
where he crashes and burns, if I remember correctly, with a couple albums, right?
Yeah, he does like, what does he do? He does like self-portrait. I can't. At some point, he becomes like a born-again Christian, and I can't remember exactly when that might be in the 80s.
I think it's the late 70s, wasn't it?
Late 70s. Okay,
Right after Blood on the Tracks.
Yeah, and he does the Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid
Movie
album.
That's early in the 70s.
73. Okay.
Now I'm pulling. It's a self-portrait is his first of the 70s, and then New Morning, which I know is a lot of Dylan fans I know love that album. I think they're both in 1970.
New Morning has the song, if I'm not mistaken, for that opens the Big Lebowski.
Oh, nice.
Might be, yeah.
Yeah.
And then he does, then it's Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and
Dylan, then Planet Waves, and then Blood on the Tracks, which we will cover in the 70s. So I didn't realize there were that many. I knew about Self-Portrait, New Morning.
Desire, right? That's another well-regarded one.
Yeah, that's mid 76. We actually almost covered that. I think that's 102 in the 70s. So,
gotcha. Okay.
But yeah, this is when you talk about Dylan and like why people love him so much, or most people do, right? It's the 60s, and you got stuff thrown in there like Blood on the Tracks. He did come back in the 2000s with very critically acclaimed album, and even this year he had an album out this year that I've seen was high up. If you look on best ever albums, it's like in the top 10 or something. The album that he had out this year. So people still love him, and they saw that the stuff that he's done really since like the last 20 years. Overall it's been pretty. Pretty well regarded. He did a Christmas album. He does like up on the rooftop and stuff. He does these like Santa Claus songs in his really raspy Dylan voice, which is very interesting to say the least. But the 60s is really the bread and butter of Dylan, and where I usually stay. I usually don't go to the other stuff.
Have you listened to that 70s stuff? Besides Blood on the
Tracks? Not a whole lot of Blood on the Tracks. I know songs from some of the albums, but I haven't, as far as knowing the albums, no. No, I would say no.
Dylan's 70s is a lot like Neil Young's 80s, in my experience. That he's all over the place. Although Neil Young's 70s are kind of like that too. But I think it's just, from my knowledge of those albums, it's a potpourri of stuff, whereas his albums in the 60s sort of hem a little bit closer to each other.
But I also think it's one of those things where I've just read so many times before, like how bad, like it's just notorious about how bad he got compared to what he did. Because this is like groundbreaking stuff that's just like iconic, and then he just went to do like
but you
not
can't
even
trust
mediocre.
Those people. You
right,
can't trust those people because they've already shown that they're not. You know what I mean? Like revisionist history on so much.
Oh sure,
stuff
but I'm just saying that when I heard so much stuff about it, I was like, you know what, I have enough, and I love this, and I'm gonna go. I don't want to explore more because I'm hearing. I'd rather explore other things. So that was one of the reasons that I was just like, I'm good, And I heard songs here and there and he's still got songs peppered throughout, the singles and stuff that did really well, like Hurricane. That was another one from the 70s and stuff. That was, but yeah, that was one of the reasons why I was just like, I'm not going to go out and spend, $15 on a CD, that people say is good. So, I was more of that.
Well, it might be worth exploring now that we've covered pretty much all of the 60s.
Well, we're going to have at least Blood on the Tracks in the 70s, and then, in the 2000s, we'll have one. I believe there's also the 2010s as well. And then
I think Blood on the Tracks is the last one that we do on here.
We'll see. We'll see where Desire is at by the time we get to the 70s, because it's close.
He did Traveling Wilburys, though. He did. You remember those albums? So he did that.
And Rolling Thunder Review, that Martin Scorsese.
Can you name
doc.
all of the Traveling Wilburys?
I can. Can you?
Okay, I can. Josh, can you?
I cannot. No.
Oh, okay.
How many can you get, Josh?
Well,
one is Bob Dylan. I just gave you one, and now you only need 4.
Okay, so Harrison, right? George Harrison.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Tom Petty.
Yeah.
Correct.
And I don't know the fourth one.
Is it
Levon Helm?
There's
Roy
Orbison.
Roy Orbison. Okay.
Yeah.
And then there's Jeff Lynne from ELO.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I don't.
Josh, Roy Orbison died after the first album came out, and when they did the video they did a video. I forget what it was, but they're all like on a train. Yeah, on a train car. No, he's in a rocking chair that's moving back and forth, but nobody's in it because that's saved for Roy.
Is that they made 2 videos. I can remember when I was a kid watching them. It's all right, right? Oh, it's all right.
Yeah. Oh, the end of the line.
That's
the end of the line.
Yeah,
yeah.
the end of the line, and then Oh, the sweet smell of success. And
Handle Me With Care. He was
Handle
actually he
with
was in
Care,
that.
yes,
Yeah,
there
he
you
was
go.
in that.
That's-
He was
yes,
alive
he was
for
in
that
that
video.
one. I do
right.
remember that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
He had a great part in that, man. He had a great voice.
yeah.
But
I just
anyway.
always remember that. Is that the one where they're all standing over the microphone too, and like taking turns singing? Yes. Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
See, I watched
And
a
you
lot
got,
of
and that's when you
MTV
got.
growing
That's
up,
when
so,
you got. Yeah. So you got Bob Dylan and Tom Petty singing the same part at the same time, and it's like, hey. It's like,
Well, yeah, it's like
is that a note? Is that
yeah.
a note? That
Well,
they're
it's
doing?
funny because Tom Petty's like in his peak, so he sounds great, and then Bob Dylan's like lost his voice, so it's like you've got like Tom Petty like everybody like sounding really good, and then you've got like Bob Dylan like it's like it's like all right, Bob, to the back. So
Yeah, when do we talk about Tom Petty?
Do we do a 70s?
No,
or is it
I don't think
80s?
I don't think he's on either of them.
That's
I don't
so
think
weird.
there's an
No,
album.
we have
from-
we
I
have
think,
a Tom
I
Petty.
think Wildflowers.
He's on
from
87.
The 90s.
He's the number 87 in the 80s right now.
Okay, with probably the Free Fallin' album. What was that one?
There's
called?
Full Moon Fever.
Moon Fever.
Yeah.
There you go. Yeah.
Oh, I thought we were gonna do Damn the Torpedoes. Okay.
No,
yeah,
that's
one-
70s anyway.
yeah, and that's
like
only 170.
1979. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
it's
a great
not even
album, but
close. We should cover more
Yep.
Tom Petty.
And I'm pretty sure Wildflowers is on the 90s. So yeah.
He deserves
right.
better than that.
Yeah, I know.
All right.